Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update. I'm glad to have you with us. Before we begin, a few quick notes. Our upcoming lecture series on trade wars and class wars will stream next Thursday from New York. And for those who follow our reading group, the new book, Fault Lines, The Economics of Empire and Energy, is now available. You'll find links and notes on our website. Now let's turn to today's story. Canada has just scaled back some of its retaliatory tariffs against the United States. Ottawa calls it a gesture of de-escalation. Washington, meanwhile, calls it proof that tariffs work. But buried beneath the headlines is something darker and more revealing about the economic logic of Trumpism and the fragile geometry of North American trade. This episode is titled, Canada Loosens Its Retaliation but Keeps the Steel, Aluminum, and Auto Blades, Trump's Negotiating Trap. Here's what's happening. Canada, under pressure from both domestic industry and U.S. importers, decided to lift several minor retaliatory duties on American consumer goods, everything from ketchup to lawnmowers. But Ottawa kept what it calls the three sharp edges: steel, aluminum, and autos. These aren't random items. They are the backbone of the USMCA, the supposed replacement for NAFTA that Trump once sold as a triumph of American leverage. Before jumping in, let's recall what those tariffs meant. In 2018, Trump imposed broad duties on imported metals, invoking national security. Yes, national security against Canada, one of America's oldest allies. It was at best a political performance and at worst an economic self-harm dressed in patriotic language. Ottawa responded in kind. Tariffs on U.S. steel, bourbon, even toilet paper. The spiral of retaliation had begun. Now, years later, we are watching an odd choreography. Canada pulls back slightly, hoping to show goodwill and reopen industrial coordination. But Washington keeps the knife pressed against the artery of the continental supply chain, the steel and aluminum that flow across the Great Lakes region, binding together factories from Windsor to Detroit, from Monterey to Milwaukee. Let's not forget, these industries aren't foreign. They're deeply integrated. The average North American car crosses the U.S.-Canada border 7 or 8 times before final assembly. The same bolts, engines, and panels circulate within what economists call a production ecosystem. When tariffs slice through that network, they don't protect jobs, they fragment them. A car part delayed in Windsor is a shift cut in Michigan. This is the paradox of Trump's America First approach, a nationalism that undermines the very continental base America depends on. The more tariffs he adds, the less control Washington actually has over supply stability. Canadian suppliers hoard inventories, Mexican producers hedge contracts, and U.S. automakers start pricing uncertainty into every model. The so-called leverage turns into chaos, a roulette wheel where every spin depends on a presidential tweet. By the way, the fictional story of a Windsor parts plant that bets production shifts on Twitter is not far from reality. Many small manufacturers literally track Washington's policy chatter minute by minute, adjusting hours, freezing orders, or moving tooling across the border just to survive. This is not efficiency. This is gambling under imperial management. What's Ottawa doing? Playing defense? Canadian officials know they can't win a tariff war with the U.S., but they also know surrendering too quickly would look politically suicidal. So they craft a halfway strategy, symbolic easing on consumer goods, but retention of pressure points on metals and autos. Economically, it's a compromise. Politically, it's a message: we will cooperate but not crawl. And here lies the trap, because Trump's White House, and now much of Washington's trade bureaucracy, interprets every concession not as diplomacy, but as weakness. In the logic of Trumpist negotiation, if your opponent blinks, you double the demand. Ottawa, by cooling tensions, may actually have invited the next blow. We need to understand that this is not merely a trade dispute. It's a structural unraveling of what used to be the North American Production Pact. When the U.S. begins to treat its closest neighbors as hostile actors, the USMCA loses coherence. Security tariffs and supply chain walls don't coexist. You can't have free trade zones and perpetual emergencies at the same time. What this means for workers is even clearer. In steel towns from Hamilton to Gary, in auto corridors from Windsor to Ohio, wages and shifts depend on predictability. Uncertainty is a tax of its own, one not voted on by Congress, but imposed daily through political volatility. So as Canada softens its tariffs while guarding its three blades, we should ask, who's really negotiating here? Is this economic policy or theater? Is this leverage or a slow motion disintegration of trust between nations that once shared not only markets but mutual understanding? That's where we begin. In the next part, we'll look at how Trump's tariff diplomacy doesn't just wound North America, it destabilizes the entire Western alliance, from NATO's eastern flank to Europe's defense industry. Let's move now from North America to Europe, because what's unfolding on one side of the Atlantic echoes unmistakably on the other. When Trump's Washington raises tariffs on allies and then quietly scales back troop deployments, it sends a double message, one that's not just economic or military, but civilizational. It says, you're on your own. In recent months, the United States has begun reducing its forward military presence in Eastern Europe. Officially, this is framed as strategic realignment, moving troops for flexibility, saving costs, focusing on new threats. But when you pair those moves with economic pressure, steel tariffs, aluminum tariffs, even talk of auto tariffs on European brands, a pattern emerges. America is no longer offering protection in exchange for partnership. It's demanding tribute while retreating. Let's be clear about what this means. For 70 years, Europe's industrial and security architecture rested on a trade. The U.S. provided defense and strategic stability. Europe provided loyalty, markets, and open access for American capital. It was an implicit bargain, the Pax Americana, cemented after World War II. But under Trump's doctrine, that equilibrium fractures. He tells European allies, pay more for NATO, buy less from China, but also face tariffs if you sell too much steel to us. It's a riddle with no answer except submission. Here's the irony. While Trump invoked national security to justify tariffs, those very tariffs have eroded the shared security base the West once relied on. European industries are now forced to pay more for imported metals, machinery, and energy. Inflation seeps into consumer prices, hitting workers hardest. At the same time, U.S. troop withdrawals make those same nations shoulder higher defense costs. The result, a continent that pays more for both safety and scarcity. And let's not forget the human side of this abstraction. Imagine a small Polish town, say Zamość, where a local steelworks supplies parts for NATO infrastructure and U.S. vehicles stationed nearby. Suddenly, steel prices jump because of American tariffs. The local plant cuts back. Workers face layoffs. Then the U.S. announces it's pulling a battalion from the region. The town loses not just economic activity, but symbolic reassurance. The factory owner writes an open letter to the residents, a fictional letter, but one that could easily exist in real life. When your electric bill rises because of steel tariffs, we also lose a company of American troops. Both disappear quietly under the banner of efficiency. We are told this is independence, but whose independence is it? That letter captures the absurdity of the moment. Europe is being told to stand on its own while being economically kneecapped by its supposed ally. Washington's message is that sovereignty means obedience. The paradox is painful. The more Europe tries to diversify, to build its own defense industry, to secure energy from non-US sources, the more it's accused of betrayal. Now, let's pull back and ask a deeper question. What happens when national security becomes a catch-all justification for everything from tariffs to troop movements? The term loses meaning. It becomes a brand, a stamp of approval for whatever serves short-term domestic politics. In Trump's Washington, national security wasn't about defending allies. It was about defending poll numbers. By the way, this strategy has winners. Not in Europe, not among American workers, but among energy exporters and weapons manufacturers. Moscow smiles as NATO's cohesion wavers. U.S. defense contractors enjoy a surge in orders from anxious European capitals. Oil traders profit from every disruption in transatlantic coordination. The invisible hand, it seems, works best when holding a grenade. Let's remember history here. In the 1,930 seconds, when protectionism swept across continents, nations justified tariffs as tools of strength. But the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1,930, much like Trump's steel tariffs, didn't make America safer. It deepened global distrust and accelerated the slide toward depression and war. Today's echoes are unmistakable. We're watching a rerun, this time in high definition. Here's what that tells us. When economic nationalism couples with geopolitical withdrawal, the outcome is fragmentation. Europe's unity weakens, America's credibility decays, and adversaries find room to maneuver. It's not strategy, it's entropy. In a system where every ally becomes a rival, there can be no stable order. You can't tax your friends and then ask them to share your battles. You can't call for unity while cashing in on division. Yet that's precisely what Trump's policy architecture demands. So the next time you hear about a strong America protecting its interests, look closer. Ask who pays the bill. Because right now, that bill lands in the mailboxes of European families, higher prices, higher defense budgets, lower trust. The invisible war of tariffs is fought not on battlefields, but in grocery stores and electricity statements. In the next section, we'll examine how this dual strategy, taxing allies and abandoning posts, is reshaping Europe's own economic response, the quiet rise of a continental defense industry, and the reluctant realization that the age of U.S. guardianship is ending. When the United States taxes its allies and retracts its protection, it triggers something Washington didn't anticipate. Europe starts to arm itself economically, militarily, and psychologically. But this self-arming is not a triumph of sovereignty. It's an act of necessity born out of disillusionment. Over the past few years, European governments, particularly in France, Germany, and Poland, have accelerated the creation of joint defense initiatives. You've probably heard the acronyms PESCO, EDF, and the European defense fund. Behind those bureaucratic names lies a quiet revolution, an attempt to reclaim the capacity for collective security without depending entirely on American command. Let's remember how we got here. Trump's withdrawal announcements from Syria, from parts of Germany, from the eastern NATO flank were framed as burden sharing, but what they really did was force Europe to fill a vacuum for the first time in decades. Leaders from Paris to Warsaw realized that Washington's guarantee was no longer sacred. You could pay your 2% of GDP, raise the flag, and still find your skies unguarded tomorrow. So Europe responded cautiously, unevenly, but unmistakably. Defense budgets began to climb. Joint research programs for drones, cyber defense, and missile systems emerged. Yet here's the contradiction. Every euro spent on new armament is a euro not spent on social welfare, green transition, or public health. The so-called autonomy comes at the expense of the European social contract. And remember those tariffs? They ripple through this equation like an acid. The same steel and aluminum that Europe now needs for tanks, ships, and satellite frames are taxed when crossing into or out of the U.S. market. Prices rise. Energy costs compound. Inflation erodes purchasing power. What Washington calls strategic decoupling, Europeans experience as austerity. In other words, Trump's America First transformed Europe's balancing act into a tightrope over an open pit. Defend yourself, but with costlier materials. Secure your supply chains, but without American cooperation. Maintain loyalty, but absorb the punishment. We see the effects on the ground. In Germany, industrial energy prices have soared to nearly double pre-2020 levels. In Poland and the Baltics, where fear of Russian aggression runs deep, municipalities are diverting budgets from housing or education to fortify bases and storage depots. The fictional Polish mayor's letter we mentioned earlier could be rewritten across a dozen towns. Each new invoice for electricity is also an invoice for insecurity. Meanwhile, in Brussels, bureaucrats talk about strategic sovereignty, but the phrase rings hollow. When your energy comes from foreign pipelines, your metals are priced in US dollars, and your soldiers still train under American command structures. What kind of sovereignty depends on the goodwill of tariffs? This is the new paradox of Europe. Forced independence with independence. The United States retreats but doesn't release. It disciplines through markets instead of armies. The European Union, built on the dream of integration, now faces internal fragmentation by external design. By the way, we shouldn't underestimate the psychological shift happening here. For decades, the European elite believed the transatlantic alliance was permanent, an anchor of liberal order. Now they whisper privately about post-American Europe. Defense ministers talk about stockpiling ammunition. Finance ministers about stockpiling semiconductors. Fear becomes fiscal policy. Let's not romanticize this transformation. The rebirth of European defense industries will enrich the same corporate circles that once profited under U.S. contracts, Airbus, Rheinmetall, Dassault, the same old military-industrial complex, but with a new logo, European-made. Workers may get jobs, yes, but at the cost of higher prices and renewed militarization. Europe's new autonomy may look less like freedom and more like preparation for permanent tension. Historically, we've seen this pattern before. In the early Cold War, Europe rearmed under U.S. command. In the 2022, it rearms against uncertainty about U.S. command. Different motive, same machinery. The names of the enemies change, but the logic remains. Fear sells. Here's what all this tells us. Trump's twin policies, tariff pressure and troop withdrawal, didn't simply disrupt alliances. They reprogrammed the Western economy into a state of chronic insecurity. When every partner doubts the other, defense becomes the only shared project left. NATO becomes less about collective security and more about collective procurement. And who benefits? The answer is not hard to find. Energy companies, weapons manufacturers, financial speculators betting on instability, they thrive. Ordinary citizens, meanwhile, pay twice, once through taxes for defense and again through prices inflated by tariffs and disrupted trade. So when Trump boasts that his policies made allies pay their fair share, remember this: they're paying all right in euros, in zlotys, in public trust. The only question is whether that payment buys any real security or just another illusion packaged in the language of strength. Let's return now to the continent where this drama first began, North America, because what's happening between Washington and Ottawa, and by extension Mexico City, is not just a trade dispute. It's the quiet dismantling of a 25-year experiment in continental integration. The USMCA, once hailed as a modernized NAFTA, was supposed to stabilize that integration. Instead, under Trump's design, it has become a mechanism of fragmentation. Before jumping in, let's recall what made NAFTA unique. It wasn't simply a free trade deal. It was a production blueprint. Over 3 decades, industries in the US, Canada, and Mexico learned to think as one organism. Car engines built in Ontario were fitted with electronics from Chihuahua and assembled in Michigan. Supply chains weren't political borders, they were arteries. Trump's tariffs sliced through those arteries in the name of national security. His administration argued that foreign-made steel threatened America's industrial base, even when that steel came from Canadian mills powered by U.S. raw materials. The result? Disruption on both sides of the border. Canadian plants slowed production. U.S. auto factories faced shortages. Mexican suppliers braced for price shocks. It was as if a surgeon had decided to prove his skill by wounding his own patient. Today, that wound is festering. While Canada cautiously rolls back some retaliatory duties, it keeps its 3 blades, steel, aluminum, and autos. Mexico, too, quietly hedges, redirecting supply contracts toward Asia. In effect, the USMCA partners are disentangling themselves from the very network that once guaranteed their competitiveness. Here's what that looks like on the ground. In Windsor, Ontario, a city that breathes in rhythm with Detroit, an auto parts factory sits half idle. The manager, fictitious but all too real in spirit, describes his daily life as betting on a tweet. Every morning, he checks Washington's latest statements before deciding whether to run the night shift. A tariff rumor means layoffs. A promise of relief means overtime. We used to plan by quarter, he says. Now we plan by tweet. That's not strategy. That's chaos with a flag on it. Let's not be fooled by the rhetoric of economic nationalism. The U.S. does not make its cars, planes, or electronics alone. Even the most patriotic pickup truck, say a Ford F-150, contains roughly 40% of its components sourced from Canada or Mexico. That's how modern capitalism works, through interdependence disguised as independence. When Trump talks about bringing production home, he's not reshoring. He's relabeling imports as victories. Here's the deeper irony. While tariffs were meant to protect American workers, they've actually made the North American labor market more precarious. Auto unions on both sides of the border report that uncertainty, not outsourcing, is now their biggest threat. A contract signed today might be void tomorrow if a new tariff hits. Workers can't plan, factories can't invest, economies can't breathe. By the way, economists at Deloitte estimated that the tariff regime raised material costs for North American energy and manufacturing sectors by anywhere from 4% to 40%. That's not a typo, 40%. More than $50 billion in industrial projects were delayed or canceled because inputs suddenly became unaffordable. And all this in the name of self-reliance. Let's call this what it is: economic isolation dressed as patriotism. The idea that America can wall off its economy from its closest partners while maintaining prosperity is a myth that sells well on cable news but fails in the factory yard. The irony is that Trump's policy didn't just weaken foreign suppliers, it weakened America's own productive ecosystem, because supply chains aren't foreign, they're circular. When one link breaks, the entire loop strains. Now, think about what this means politically. Washington gains a talking point. We stood up to unfair trade. Ottawa and Mexico City gain a headache. How do we adapt without provoking more retaliation? Meanwhile, corporations exploit the confusion. Multinationals relocate their headquarters on paper to whichever side of the border offers a temporary advantage. Jobs shift, taxes vanish, and the working class watches the flag-wrapped spectacle, told to cheer for its own instability. Let's not forget history here. The original NAFTA, flawed as it was, at least recognized that production could no longer be purely national. The goal was to manage that interdependence, not deny it. Trump reversed that logic. He turned management into denial. And denial, in economics as in medicine, is a form of slow suicide. In the 1,980 seconds, Reagan used tariffs selectively as bargaining chips. Trump used them indiscriminately. As ideology, the difference matters. A bargaining chip is temporary. An ideology becomes permanent even after its creator leaves office. Today, even post-Trump policymakers hesitate to lift those duties for fear of appearing soft. That's how economic nationalism survives, as a political ghost haunting rational policy. So when we speak of the disunited states of North America, we mean more than geography. We mean an economic divorce inside a shared household. Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. still live under the same roof for the USMCA, but no one shares a dinner table anymore. Trust has been replaced by suspicion, cooperation by calculation, and yet this unraveling was entirely predictable. You cannot build unity through threats. You cannot demand loyalty while imposing punishment. The North American experiment thrived when it recognized mutual dependence as strength. Trump's trade war turned that strength into a vulnerability. Now let's move from steel and autos to something even more essential: energy. Because Trump's tariff strategy didn't stop at factories and furnaces, it bled into pipelines, refineries, and fuel tanks. It turned the North American energy network, one of the most integrated in the world, into another battlefield for political theater. Let's begin with a simple fact. The United States doesn't refine enough heavy crude to sustain itself. It needs Canada's oil sands, Mexico's heavy blends, and even imported feedstocks to balance its refineries. For decades, this arrangement worked smoothly. Canadian crude flowed south, U.S. refined products flowed north, and both economies shared profits. It wasn't charity, it was efficiency. Then came Trump's energy dominance doctrine, a slogan that promised independence but delivered instability. In 2018 and again in 2020, Washington began floating tariffs on Canadian crude and Mexican refined products under the same familiar justification. National security, the message was absurd, as if a borderless pipeline network could be treated like an invading army. Before jumping in, let's recall the math. Canada supplies roughly 60% of U.S. oil imports. Most of it travels through pipelines like Keystone, Enbridge, and Trans Mountain. When tariffs enter that equation, the cost ripples instantly through refineries from the Midwest to the Gulf Coast. Diesel, gasoline, jet fuel all tick upward. You don't need a PhD in economics to see what happens next. Consumers pay the difference while politicians claim victory. And that's exactly what unfolded. Trump's 10% tariff on Canadian crude, coupled with 25% on Mexican steel used for pipelines, raised project costs across the sector. Deloitte and Rystad Energy both warned that supply chain inflation in North American oil and gas could reach 40%, a figure that quietly materialized as delayed drilling, canceled midstream projects, and postponed refinery upgrades. But the rhetoric never changed. We're achieving energy independence, Trump declared, as the U.S. imported record volumes of Canadian oil. The contradiction was almost poetic. America became independent by deepening dependence, importing more from the very neighbors it was punishing. This is where irony turns to farce. A Canadian crude producer, hit by tariffs on its own exports, starts buying USOV, made pipeline valves that are themselves taxed as imported steel. Both sides pay more. Both sides lose margins. And the only winner is the illusion of patriotism, a televised triumph over an imaginary enemy. Let's not forget the human cost. In Alberta, thousands of oil field workers saw projects suspended or delayed. In Texas, refiners struggled with mismatched crude slates and rising feedstock costs. Truck drivers hauling fuel across the Midwest faced shrinking margins as pump prices rose faster than wages. Each of these stories connects to the same policy fiction, the myth that protectionism equals security. By the way, this myth has deep roots. In the 1,970 seconds after the OPEC crisis, energy independence became the sacred chant of American politics. Every president since Nixon has promised it, but none achieved it because energy systems, like economies, are ecosystems. You can't wall them off. Oil doesn't respect borders, and neither do the companies that sell it. Exxon, Suncor, Shell, they operate on both sides of every wall. Here's the real paradox. Trump sold tariffs as a tool of national resilience, but in practice, they weakened resilience by turning integrated systems into segmented fiefdoms. Refineries that once optimized supply now scramble for whatever crude they can get tariff-free. Equipment suppliers hoard inventory. Contractors hedge on price spikes. The whole system grows brittle, like an overworked machine losing its lubrication. Let's not be fooled by the security argument. The U.S. didn't impose tariffs because it feared Canada or Mexico. It did so because national security provides a legal shortcut, a way to override Congress, dodge WTO rules, and consolidate executive power. It's economic nationalism weaponized as governance. And who benefits? Not the working class, not the consumer. The beneficiaries are the traders who speculate on volatility, the lobbyists who write exceptions, and the political operatives who convert economic pain into campaign slogans. America first turned policy into spectacle. Every disruption became proof of strength. Every crisis, a commercial break for defiance. Now, as energy prices fluctuate across North America, the bill for that spectacle arrives in silence, higher fuel costs, delayed infrastructure, and an eroding sense of cooperation. Ottawa talks about climate transition, Washington about dominance, Mexico about sovereignty, but each pursues its path in isolation, even as the pipelines beneath them remain welded together. It shows us something fundamental. Energy independence is not a goal. It's a story, a comforting myth that governments tell when they no longer trust their neighbors or their own citizens. The U.S., Canada, and Mexico built an energy community out of geography and necessity. Trump turned it into a casino of tariffs, slogans, and uncertainty. Now let's turn back across the Atlantic to Europe, where the aftershocks of Trump's tariff and troop strategy are still being felt in every electricity bill and every budget hearing. Because when the United States weaponized trade and scaled down its defense presence, it didn't just change diplomacy, it changed the price of energy. Let's start with a simple observation. Europe's security and its energy markets have always been twins. For decades, NATO protection allowed European states to rely on cheap Russian gas without fear of political blackmail. U.S. troops on the eastern flank were the insurance policy. Pipelines through Ukraine were the delivery system. It was an uneasy balance, but it worked. Then came Trump's doctrine of sovereign burden. The message was blunt. Pay more for your defense, buy American LNG, and stop depending on Moscow. On paper, that sounded like strategic diversification. In practice, it was a transfer of costs from Washington's military budget to Europe's households. Here's what that looked like. When Trump slapped tariffs on European steel and aluminum, energy costs for smelters and manufacturers jumped overnight. Production in Germany's Ruhr Valley and Poland's Silesia fell by as much as 20%. Plants that had relied on steady Russian gas found themselves paying for imported American liquefied natural gas priced in dollars, not euros, and shipped halfway around the world. At the same time, the U.S. began drawing down its troops from Eastern Europe. Officially, this was about strategic flexibility. In reality, it was a symbolic retreat, a quiet withdrawal of the very security umbrella that once justified American leadership. The message was unmistakable. Pay more for our gas, pay more for your army, and pay tariffs on your exports. Let's not forget the everyday consequences. In Poland, electricity prices rose by more than 40% between 2018 and 2022. In Germany, households saw their annual energy bills swell to record highs, and as if to mock the entire system, Russian gas traders quietly expanded their exports to Asia, bypassing Europe altogether. The winner of this geopolitical arithmetic wasn't Brussels or Washington. It was Moscow, collecting revenue and watching NATO's cohesion erode one invoice at a time. The fictional letter from the Polish mayor, "When our power bills rise, we lose a battalion too," captures this perfectly, because it isn't just metaphorical. Towns across Eastern Europe literally lost both affordable energy and visible American protection. That's what Trump's policies delivered: austerity wrapped in nationalism, insecurity disguised as sovereignty. Before jumping to conclusions, let's trace the logic. Trump's administration framed everything: tariffs, troop shifts, even energy policy under one umbrella term: national security. But when you stretch that concept to cover every act of economic coercion, it stops meaning anything. Security becomes the justification for insecurity. This is where irony turns systemic. European governments eager to prove loyalty rushed to sign contracts for American LNG and defense equipment. They called it strategic realignment. In truth, they were paying a premium for uncertainty, buying expensive gas to replace affordable pipelines, buying American-made weapons to compensate for American troop withdrawals. That's not alliance management, that's a protection racket. Let's remember, the U.S. didn't offer Europe a better deal. It offered dependence in a different currency. The same corporate giants that dominate U.S. energy markets, ExxonMobil, Cheniere, Chevron, now profit from Europe's strategic anxiety. Every LNG terminal built on the Baltic coast is both an engineering feat and a political monument to coercion. And yet, European leaders justify it as progress. They say we're freeing ourselves from Russian influence. Fair enough. But at what cost? Energy bills that spark protests, industries that relocate to Asia, and inflation that fuels political extremism. The irony is almost unbearable. In trying to escape one dependency, Europe walked into another, more expensive, more fragile, and more politicized. Here's what that tells us about the new transatlantic relationship. It's no longer based on shared prosperity, but on shared vulnerability. The United States uses tariffs and troop movements to manufacture leverage. Europe, desperate to prove loyalty, pays the bill. The result is a continent less secure, less industrially competitive, and more divided than before. Let's not romanticize the past. NATO was never a charity, but it was, for a time, a predictable arrangement. Under Trump, predictability vanished. In its place, Europe inherited an invoice with no ceiling, higher defense spending, higher energy costs, and higher inflation. The real cost of America First wasn't paid in Washington. It was paid in Warsaw, Berlin, and Paris by workers who never voted for this alliance of contradictions. Let's step back now and look at the bigger picture, because what Trump began with tariffs and troop withdrawals has become the template for a new kind of global capitalism, one built not on cooperation, but coercion. It's a world where allies aren't partners anymore. They're clients. And clients, as we know, pay to stay in business. Here's the essence of the Trump economic worldview. Trade is not mutual benefit, it's tribute. Every transaction must prove American dominance. Every ally must pay its fair share. But fair share here doesn't mean equality, it means obedience. The message is clear. The price of protection is submission. We've seen this logic before, though it wore different uniforms. In the 19th century, empires justified tariffs as civilizing missions. In the 20th, superpowers used aid and bases to buy loyalty. The 21st century version uses tariffs, sanctions, and financial blacklists. The tools have changed, but the impulse is the same. Convert interdependence into hierarchy. Trump didn't invent this dynamic. He merely said out loud what the system already practiced. When he told NATO allies to pay up or else, he revealed what globalization had been hiding, that behind the rhetoric of free markets lies a structure of compulsion. You trade on our terms, you spend on our weapons, you align with our sanctions, or you become the next target. Let's not forget the irony. Trump railed against globalism while embodying its core principle, transactional dominance. He treated trade deals like casino bets, foreign bases like franchises, and diplomacy like branding. He called it America First, but it was really America for rent. Now, why does this matter economically? Because it replaces stability with permanent leverage. If every country is constantly renegotiating under threat of tariffs, currency wars, or troop withdrawals, no one invests long term. Companies hoard cash instead of building capacity. Governments plan quarter to quarter instead of decade to decade. Growth becomes hostage to the next tweet, the next executive order, the next tariff list. This is not capitalism as productivity. This is capitalism as extortion. Let's look at the numbers. During Trump's trade war with China, U.S. manufacturers paid an estimated $46 billion in additional tariffs. American farmers required $28 billion in emergency subsidies to offset retaliatory losses. Those aren't victories, they're bailouts for self-inflicted wounds. Meanwhile, the global supply chain reoriented not toward America, but around it. Southeast Asia, India, and the European Union quietly filled the gaps. America's decoupling became everyone else's market opportunity. By the way, Europe learned that lesson quickly. When Washington taxed its exports, it sought new customers in Asia and Africa. When U.S. troops withdrew, European defense industries grew bolder in selling to third markets. In trying to isolate others, Trump's America ended up isolating itself not by force, but by fatigue. Allies grew tired of being scolded. They began to adapt, and yet the damage remains. The world took note that America's word was conditional, its alliances transactional, and its policies unpredictable. Once that trust breaks, it doesn't come back easily. Even under new administrations, the specter of tariff diplomacy haunts every negotiation. The logic of Trumpism, make them pay, lingers in the machinery of trade policy, in the fine print of defense contracts, in the unspoken calculus of every foreign capital. Let's not be fooled by the rhetoric of strength. What we're witnessing is not dominance, but decay, a system that confuses fear with respect. In the short term, coercion can buy compliance. In the long term, it breeds alternatives. The BRICS bloc expands, the EU experiments with strategic autonomy, and regional coalitions form precisely to escape this suffocating interdependence. History tells us this doesn't end well. When Britain's empire turned its colonies into captive markets, it sparked independence movements. When America turns its allies into clients, it invites the same backlash, only this time in boardrooms instead of battlefields. Every tariff imposed on a partner accelerates the search for a substitute. Every sanction issued creates a parallel payment system. Every insult delivered under the banner of sovereignty pushes the world toward fragmentation. In other words, Trump didn't just disrupt trade, he reprogrammed globalization itself. He replaced the idea of a shared market with a contested fortress. Under this logic, cooperation is weakness and competition is permanent. There are no friends, only deals. No stability, only leverage. But here's the paradox, and it's a painful one. A world built on leverage eventually collapses under its own weight. When everyone tries to extract tribute, no one invests in the common good. Infrastructure decays. Climate cooperation stalls. Energy transitions freeze. The same nationalism that promises independence ends up producing universal dependence on fear, on scarcity, on unpredictability. That's the real legacy of Trump's trade revolution, not renewal, but anxiety as a governing principle. Every nation becomes both predator and prey. Every negotiation becomes a standoff. And in this constant state of tension, democracy, the capacity to deliberate and plan collectively, begins to erode.